All right, hello everyone. So we're going to get back to it here. And so our next topic is still continuing on Athens, as it says here, birth of Athenian democracy. And this man named Kleisthenes is going to be a key person we're going to talk about. But we got to talk about a few things before we jump into this kind of idea of one of the big contributions we get from the ancient Greeks, which is this idea of democracy. So remember, we're talking about Athens and Sparta. We're comparing the two city-states. That was kind of what we were talking about in our last lecture. And of course, if anybody's just watching this just for the sake of learning Athenian democracy, we're going to get to that in a minute. But for my students, I want to make sure you kind of are following along of where we were. And so comparing Athens and Sparta, we did some similarities about them. And now we're going to kind of focus more on Athens. And even before we get into explaining how Athenian democracy developed, there's a few basic characteristics I want you to know about Athens. So please just jot these down and then we'll go talk about the government of Athens. So number one, Athens is very dynamic. That's one thing I want everybody to know about them. They're always involved in other people's affairs. They don't just stay static to or isolated inside of Athens. That maybe have to do a little bit with the geography that we talked about in the previous lecture because, you know, Athens is closer to the coast and it's just kind of their nature to be involved in things more. Another interesting point about Athens is they're very dynamic. They change a lot. And what I mean by that, if you look at this period between 800 and 400 BC, when a lot of big things are happening in the Greek world, you know, Athens is changing. Its way of thinking changes. Its government changes. You know, Athens actually starts as an oligarchy and then will become a democracy. And very interesting, it's actually not just going to become a democracy, and I'll focus on this in more detail as we get to this, but it's going to become a pure democracy, purer than what we have in the United States today, even. So we'll look at that. The other basic thing I want you to know about Athens is it's large. It's got about 300,000 people who live in Athens. And, you know, one of the interesting questions I actually pose to my students when I do this in class is I say, okay, well, we know Athens will eventually become a democracy. It starts as an oligarchy, becomes a pure democracy. Remember, oligarchy is rule of a few. So when it becomes a democracy and becomes this pure democracy, you know, how many of those 300,000 people in Athens actually are part of the Athenian democratic system? And I have students guess numbers and so forth. And it turns out it's only about 30,000 actually. And so you go, well, how do we call this? If we put 30,000 here, right? How do we call this a pure democracy if only about 10% of their population is part of it? And I'm going to explain that. One thing I do want all my students to jot down again is what makes you part of this democracy. So there's like 3, 4 things here. So go ahead, get these ideas down as well. Number one, to be part of this pure democracy in Athens that will become one. First, we're going to talk about how it develops, and then we'll talk about, you know, how to become what you need to be part of this pure democracy. You had to be born in Athens. That's number one. Number two, both your parents had to be born in Athens. Number three, you had to be not a slave, right? You couldn't be a slave. How does one become a slave in the ancient world? Either you're captured or you couldn't pay your debt. Make sure you make a note of that. You had to be an adult as well, and of course you had to be male, right? If you weren't male, then you wouldn't be considered part of the Athenian system of government. So you had to be, again, born in Athens, both your parents born in Athens. You had to be an adult, which was, I believe, 18 for the Athenians. You had to be not a slave, and you had to be male. And so that's how we only get 30,000, which of course leads to an interesting question. How can we call it a pure democracy if only 30,000 out of 300,000 are part of it? Well, we're going to explain. So make sure you watch the whole lecture and you're going to see how all this works. And of course, you're going to need to know all the details as we go through this. All right, so that's just the basic setup. So now the question is, before we even talk about Kleisthenes, you don't just snap your finger one day and Athens becomes a democracy. It's a long road, and there's a lot of people involved. And if you were to take a course just on Greek history, you'd go into a lot more detail on this than I'm going to. But there's at least a few people I want you to know. And so there's going to be 3 key names that I want you to know about this. So let's talk about the 3 people I want you to know, starting with this man named Draco. So first of all, I talked about what makes you an Athenian citizen. We covered that in the previous slide, so make sure you have all that down. And then, you know, these individuals. So we have Draco. So Draco, He was what we call an archon in the year 350 BC, right? So around 620 BC. I don't know why I said 350 there. Around 620 BC. He's Draco. He's an archon. The archons were the rulers of Athens when it was an oligarchy, rule of a few. And one of the things that happened as a ruler of Athens, people went to Draco and said, "Hey, Draco, we want the laws in Athens written down." And Draco said, "Sure, no problem. I'll write down the laws." Now, does writing down the laws make you a democracy? And the answer to that is obviously no. But if you don't even have laws written down, it's hard for a democracy to develop. So I kind of throw in this as kind of the early developments of things that will eventually lead to democracy in Athens. So that's one thing you want to know about Draco, kind of the road to democracy in Athens. He writes down the laws. The other thing I want you to know about Draco is his name. And this is, again, one of those great contributions we get that are still with us today. So for those of you who are taking my class, you have that chart where I talk about all the contributions we have. And if you look at the Greeks, you have the words, the outline that I put in your module. I believe it's in week 2. And one of the things is all the words we have in our English language from the Greek history. One word that we use is draconian. We use that word today in our English language. What does draconian mean? Well, it's a word you've all heard of before. It's probably one of those words that just went right over your head. But draconian simply means harsh. Why does draconian mean harsh? Well, because when Draco wrote down the laws, he wrote down harsh laws. So Draco, draconian, harsh. If the laws were soft, the word draconian would mean soft today. So even sounds harsh, so it works out really well. All right, so that's one. The next person I want you to know about is a man named Solon. So Solon, he comes around 600 BC, a little bit later. He's also a leader of Athens when it was still an oligarchy, a rule of a few. And what Solon does, a couple things. One, he'll expand the number of people who are involved in the governmental system to, I believe, like 400 people. So a little bit bigger, but still not every Athenian citizen gets a voice per se. But the other thing Solon does, which I really want you to know about, you want to know about both. Again, as always, you don't just want to write down the keywords. You want to add all the details I say about each keyword. Is Solon, when he comes into power, there's an issue in Athens. There's a lot of people becoming slaves. How did they become slaves? Well, they couldn't pay their debt. And so Solon outlaws debt slavery. He says you can't pay, if you don't pay your debt, you're not going to necessarily become a slave. Now, what that does is it kind of opens the door for more Athenians to eventually be what we would call citizens. Now, again, we still have another 100 years to pass before Athens becomes a democracy, and this is much more complex with more moving parts and more people coming in. But I do think at the end of the day, Solon outlawing debt slavery is a factor, is another step towards Athenian democracy. So Draco writes down the laws, Solon expands the number of people who participate in Athenian government, outlaws debt slavery, but the key person, of course, is going to be Kleisthenes, and that comes about 100 years later. So Kleisthenes, the father of democracy, Athenian democracy, and he's going to do a few things that I want to explain. So this is all, again, around the year 508 BC, 509 BC, roughly. And Kleisthenes, he's going to do 3 major things that I want you to know about. So in Athens, you had this bull, this governing body of Athens. What Kleisthenes does is he makes it so there's going to be 500 Athenian citizens in the bull. Now, this is how you're going to get this pure democracy, so you want to follow this carefully. There were about 30,000 Athenian citizens, right? 30,000 Athenian citizens. Kleisthenes says, I'm going to take these Athenian citizens, divide them up into 10 tribes. The bull has 500 members. And therefore, he says, each of the 10 tribes, again, the bull was around before, Kleisthenes will just expand it to 500, will get to put 50 of its people, 50 of its citizens in the governing body. So the bull is the governing body. There's 10 tribes in Athens he creates. He says each tribe gets to put 50 people, hence 500. Now, each tribe in Athens has thousands of people, thousands of citizens, right? Born in Athens, male, all the things we talked about before. So how do they pick them? How do they pick these 50 individuals? And what's interesting is it's not done by voting. You would think democracy, done by voting. No, it's not done by how old you are. It's not done by how much wealth you have. It's done randomly, where 50 people are randomly picked. And those 50 people each serve in the bull for what I believe is called a prytany. You don't need to know that term, but about a short period of time, month and a half or so, they serve, and then they go back home. And then 50 new people are picked. And so if you pause and you think about that, what ends up happening is if you are an Athenian citizen, sooner or later, you're going to have a chance to serve in the governing body of Athens. That's what makes it more of a pure democracy. To give you kind of a perspective, it would be as though every American citizen would be able to serve directly in the House of Representatives or directly in our Senate. Now, we don't do that in the United States, right? We are technically not a democracy. In the United States, we're a democratic republic. We elect representatives. Now, why don't we like a democracy? Why don't we just do majority rule and all of that, and we'll have just everyone vote on everything and everyone serve in the governing body? Well, there's several reasons for that. One, it's not practical. We're just too big, right? Too many people. The other thing is, it's not what our founding fathers wanted. They actually feared this idea of, pure majority rule and, the tyranny of the majority and all of these ideas that they believed a system of electing representatives is a safer system for a more stable society. So we do have a democracy because we elect these representatives, but we're not a pure democracy where every single American citizen gets a say-so in every single issue and, sits in every governing body. But that's what Kleisthenes wanted. So that's interesting, right? So every single Athenian citizen will essentially have a chance to serve in the body, which leads to another interesting question before we talk about these next two terms. Does this mean every Athenian citizen has equal influence in Athens? And if you stop and you think about that, and this is always great for class discussion because I ask my students this, and the answer is obviously no. And you go, well, why not? If every Athenian citizen has equal chance to serve in the governing body, why don't they all have equal influence in Athens? And the answer to that is obvious, human nature. There's always going to be some people who are more ambitious, some less ambitious. Some people are smarter, some are faster, some are bigger, some are slower, right? We know the deal. We're not naturally equal. And so even though every Athenian citizen has an equal chance to serve, there's always going to be somebody in Athens who's going to have more influence because of various things. Obviously having money makes you more influential. Being a war leader makes you more influential. But this is something you definitely want to make a note of. In Athens, being a great orator. If you're a really good orator, a speaker, you can influence the bull. So even if you're not sitting in the bull, you can be the influential figure, and that often makes the key person in Athens. So if you are a great war leader, if you have money, if you're a great speaker, you're the guy really pulling the strings in Athens. So that's kind of, even when you try to create a pure democracy, our human nature, I think, doesn't allow it. But Kleisthenes is working towards that, trying to give every demos, the people, a say. All right, so that's one, the bull. The second big thing I want you to know he creates is the dikastria, which is the jury system. And again, this is all part of creating democracy in Athens. So if you have like your ID on Kleisthenes, you'd want to talk about all this stuff. If you're writing an essay and you're talking about the government of Athens, don't just say Athens is a democracy. You have to explain Draco, Solon, all these things with Kleisthenes, right? Give me the details. The dikastria is the jury system where Kleisthenes creates a jury and no judges, no lawyers. You basically have a jury of people and you present your case and then the jury decides yay or nay. And so that was something he created. The third interesting thing he does to create more democracy in Athens is the ecclesia. Now, this was a group of at least 6,000 Athenian citizens. You can have more. This ecclesia is an interesting idea. Where what you would do, Kleisthenes, you'd say at least once a year, you could have it more often, at least 6,000 Athenian citizens needed to gather together. And the purpose was apparently to pick one of their fellow Athenians to punish. The way they would do this is they would all get together and every Athenian citizen would get a broken piece of clay pottery. Now, in my class, I hand out these little broken pieces of clay pottery to my students. And what you would do is you would etch in the broken piece of clay pottery, the person you wanted to punish, right? So by now you should have all these key words down. I'm going to go to my next slide here and keep talking. And this is called ostraka. So ostraka is a broken piece of clay pottery. And they would take these broken pieces of clay pottery, they would add up all the names, and whoever had the most names was the biggest winner, in this case the biggest loser, and they would be punished. Now, how would they be punished? Well, here's another one of those words we have in our English language that comes from Greek history. They would be ostracized, ostracism. So if that's a word you hopefully have heard of before, what does ostracism mean? It means to be banished. So why does ostracism mean to be banished? Because when we have this ecclesia system, the punishment would be banishment. And it's called that because they wrote it on ostraka. If the punishment was death, then ostracism today would mean death. Hope you understand that and that's clear. So that's where we get the word ostraka or ostracism from. It's from ostraka. So all these three things Kleisthenes does, the bull, growing the bull and creating this whole system, the dicastria, the ecclesia, that was all designed to give the Athenian people a bigger say-so in their governing system. So that's the Athenian government, and it is, pretty complex. It's got a lot of moving parts to it, obviously. There's a lot more to it than what I even gave you, but you definitely want to know that about Athens. What else do I want you to just generally know about Athens? The last thing I want you to know about Athens in this kind of lecture is that they were very fame-driven. And I didn't put this word up, but you can obviously just jot it down, fame. Fame was something that was very important to the Athenians, and that's something I want you to know. Another interesting idea I think you can kind of jot down, and this is really more for the Greek world, but you do see this in Athens, is this idea of a shame culture was pretty powerful in Athens. And this kind of ties in with ostracism because, when you think about the ostracism system, who would they ostracize? And they wouldn't necessarily ostracize the worst person in Athens. Very often, they would use this to ostracize a powerful person in Athens. And why is that? Well, because the goal is winning. The goal is being the top person, in a shame culture versus a guilt culture. In a guilt culture, you feel bad when you do something wrong. In a shame culture, you feel bad when you get caught. And for the Athenians, it was about winning. And, one of the things that would often happen is the top strong leaders in Athens would be ostracized, not because it was good for Athens, but it was a way for somebody else to become more influential. And this actually comes back to bite Athens. Sometimes if you take more Greek history, I remember when I took a upper division course on Greek history, we talked about how this was called the failure of shame culture. And so this is a little bit more in depth, but more specifically, just understanding that winning was very important. Pride, I think I mentioned that in a previous lecture, was very important. Fame for Athens was very important. Being known is very important. So all things are part of Athenian society. There's more to Athens, and we'll talk more about some of the Athenians as we continue to move on. So what is next? So we've talked a little bit about Athens here, right over here again, Athens, and we're talking about some of their general characteristics, their government. At the same time that Athens, of course, is doing their thing, down here you got Sparta. And so our next lecture is going to focus on Sparta, what Sparta was like. As we talk about Sparta, I'll do a little bit more comparing and contrasting with Athens as well. And of course, even after we talk about Sparta, we're still not done because then we have to talk about what happens with Athens and Sparta as they get involved with other civilizations, with each other, wars, battles. So there's still a lot more to talk about Greek history. But so far, in our first few lectures, we've talked about geography, we've talked about the similarities, and now I've focused in a bit more on Athens, talking about the government of Athens. So you should have gotten all that out of this lecture. Hopefully it's all interesting. You're enjoying it all. Of course, there's going to be a lot more coming up. That's it. So just kind of keep following along. Hopefully all that was clear, especially on the government of Athens. If you have any questions, just let me know. Everyone have a great day. Thank you.